If you think about domestic violence, and even if you've been professionally trained, you probably think about the following scenario. A man who's got some kind of extreme issues with anger and jealousy beats up his wife regularly. Maybe he uses substances, maybe he uses alcohol way too much, and that's the pattern of violence, and she tries to cover it up, and finally it's discovered. Obviously, domestic violence patterns like that are serious and need to be dealt with. But I'm here to tell you that they're also statistically pretty rare compared to the kind of domestic violence pattern you're much more likely to run into if you're a police officer and you get called to domestic calls. In practically any walk of life, the statistical type of domestic violence is very different from that. To run the tapes back a little bit on this, I'd like to tell you how we know this. And we know this through the development of something called the conflict tactics scale. That's a way of getting people to report on domestic violence in their family by answering a simple question. How do you resolve conflict when it happens in your family? Now, the advantage in asking the question this way is it gets around the problem of some people not reporting domestic violence because they don't think of it as a criminal act. So what used to be called crime victim surveys always ran into that filter. They'd ask about crimes, and people would go, I haven't been the victim of any crimes. But then when you ask them, well, exactly what has happened between you and your partner, then all kinds of technical crimes, assaults would come out. The conflict tactics scale avoids that problem. So it gives you 16 times as much report of domestic violence. So it's a very valuable instrument to know exactly how much domestic violence goes on in a society at a given time. Now, it's been used a lot since 1975, mostly in North America, but in other countries as well. And if we look at sort of compilations, what are called meta-analytic studies, which are studies that take all of the surveys that have used the conflict tactics scale and puts them all together and allows for things like different sample size in the different surveys. So it comes up with a really best estimate that's based on all the work that's been done. There's a number of really very sort of high-level papers that tell us exactly how much domestic violence goes on and what kinds of domestic violence goes on. First of these is a paper that John Archer, a psychologist in England, published in the year 2000, where he looked at 64 surveys that had been done of general populations asking about how they resolve conflict in their family, and found some very startling results, startling at that time anyway. The results that he found was that women were more likely to be perpetrators of domestic violence, or sometimes called intimate partner violence, than were men. It was not a large difference, but it was a substantial difference nevertheless, and shocking to people who had this preconceived notion that all domestic violence was male perpetrated. That's not what Archer was finding. He also found that women were injured somewhat more than men were, but not a huge amount. It was, in fact, if you use a statistic called the D prime, which looks at the distribution of injuries for women and distribution of injuries for men, you find that these two distributions almost overlap. Women are just slightly more likely to be injured, 0.05, a 20th of a standard deviation. In other words, not very much, even if you're not statistically oriented. That's a very small amount. And again, that's kind of shocking because we think of women as primary victims, in some cases sole victims of domestic violence. That's not what the data tell us. Now, if we, in fact, to sort of embellish this a little bit more, 3 years ago, Sarah Desmarais looked at all the surveys that have been done up to the present, so the year 2013, and now had 239 surveys of domestic violence and found the same kind of thing, that women were, again, more likely to be perpetrators of domestic violence and men more likely to be victims of domestic violence. And this was true whether it was a large population survey or whether it was a college student survey. It really didn't matter what the sample was. The same result kept coming up time after time after time. 239 studies finding it now. That's about as strong a finding as you're going to get in social science. And if we take 5 of these major surveys and sort of look at exactly what they tell us, and I'm thinking of 5 surveys here that have been done from 1987 up to 2007. And these are the National Comorbidity Survey done in the U.S., the National Couples Survey, the National Youth Survey, and a survey by the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. If we put all 5 of these surveys together, they tell us the following, that the most common pattern of domestic violence, time after time, is bilateral violence, two-way violence, matched for level of severity. That is, with each person using just as potentially injurious and severe actions as the other person. The second, and that's about 50%, by the way, of all domestic violence reports are bilateral. The second most frequent pattern of domestic violence is female-perpetrated domestic violence, about 35% of domestic violence reports. The third most frequent is male-perpetrated domestic violence. That's about 15% of all the reports. In other words, the so-called wife battering cases are a distant third when we look at the whole sort of panoply of domestic violence patterns that we can get. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute and how it pertains to the police. So we've got here 5 surveys, a total sample of over 20,000 people, and these same patterns keep coming out time after time after time. I'm going to come back to this. Okay, let's sort of put this aside for a minute and say, well, okay, that may all be true, but aren't women sort of the only people who get hurt by domestic violence? It is true that most of the research on victims of domestic violence has been focused exclusively on women. There's been very few studies on male victims of domestic violence for largely political reasons. But those few studies that have been done on males tell us a very different story. They tell us, again, that male victims of domestic violence are essentially going through the same kind of problems as female victims of domestic violence. There was one study done in Philadelphia on an emergency ward where they just asked everybody what the victims were, asked all the men who were coming in what the causes were of the injuries that they'd sustained. And over a 3-week period, 13% of them reported that domestic violence was the cause of the injuries that they had sustained. This is a higher number than comparable studies done on hospitals asking the same questions of female victims. These men had been burned, scalded, stabbed, suffered a number of fairly serious injuries. And the authors of the study said the number would have been higher, but they had to stop collecting data at midnight because the researchers had to go home. There was a very huge study done by Ann Coker looking at the reports that came in the National Violence Against Women Survey in the U.S., which surprisingly also had a sample of men. How they responded to a survey of violence against women, not sure. But here's one of the things that came out. When men reported being victims of domestic violence, they reported the same long-term problems as women did, the same psychological problems, depression and anxiety, the same chronic health problems, the same substance abuse problems, and all these things could be seen to exacerbate, become worse after the onset of the domestic violence. So it's the same for men and the same for women. Denise Hines was really the first person to begin to look at male victims of domestic violence and looked at a large group of men who'd sought help through a domestic violence hotline in New Hampshire. A high percentage of these men had physical injuries, and a high percentage of them had symptoms of PTSD. But when they called a domestic violence hotline for help, they were told that they were the real batterer. And if they hadn't turned, in fact, to a special hotline that was set up for men in New Hampshire, the only one at that time in North America, they would have got no help at all. Now, how does this all play into police intervention? Well, there's a very interesting study Deborah Capaldi did in Oregon. It's part of the Oregon Youth Survey, and she'd been following a number of couples between the ages of 18 and 28 for a long period of time and monitoring, amongst other things, domestic violence occurring in those couples. And so she had this long-term view of these particular couples, and she noticed that on one occasion, given that domestic violence might have been chronic or recurring with some of the couples, that on one night it would get a little worse or get a little out of hand compared to the levels it had been before, and somebody would phone 911. And when that happened, 85% of the time, it was the man who was arrested. But if you took the longer picture of these couples, you found that both of them had been using domestic violence. The women, in fact, had the same history of domestic violence toward the man as vice versa. They were mutually violent couples, but when it came to arrest and criminal justice intervention, the police just arrested the man. That man will then be put into a treatment group where he'll be asked to disclose whatever weaknesses he has as an individual that caused the domestic violence, but it may well be part of an interactive pattern going on between him and his wife. And if that's true, then just treating him as an individual is not really going to solve the problem. We have to develop a better view of domestic violence that's more inclusive, that sees that anyone can be a victim of domestic violence, male, female, straight, gay, doesn't matter. We don't have to have one model, one size fits all, and that really is getting in the way of our domestic violence intervention.